Welcome to The Business. I'm Elise Morgan. Coming up on the program, beyond the coal economy, thousands of jobs at risk. The first in our series on how coal towns are preparing for the transition.
All our other main industries are gone. Our steel, shipbuilding, rail, textiles, that's all gone. So all we've got left is mining and power, and once that goes.
And no looking back. A fast-tracked future means business will never be the same again.
I think anyone that is planning on extrapolating last year as a prior comparable period is a fool.
Those stories coming up. But first, welcome back to The Business for 2021. New year, new set, but some things stay the same. Despite the tumultuous 2020, which included recession, our love of property hasn't waned. And yet again, the Reserve Bank is faced with a difficult juggling act. Today, more data showing prices reaching record highs as the COVID housing rally continues. Why? Partly demand. The ABS shows new loan commitments now 35% higher than the beginning of last year. First home buyer activity is now at an 11-year high. So in January, every capital city saw prices rise from 2.3% in Darwin down to smaller gains for Sydney and Melbourne. Can it last despite migration through the floor and unemployment remaining elevated?
Today's data really showing that there is the potential for the housing market to become red hot when immigration lifts and when the international borders rise. And that's because interest rates are incredibly low. There's also a shortage of housing inventory, and the unemployment rate, despite being elevated, is below 7%.
Will the extreme optimism in house prices tempt the Reserve Bank to shimmy up interest rates sooner?
Well, certainly the uplift in housing activity is positive for the economic recovery story, but there are still patches of weakness, and it's very much an uneven recovery. On top of that, whilst we are about to see the rollout of the vaccines in Australia, there's still a lot of uncertainty. So we think the RBA will keep the cash rate low for at least several years, at least until 2023.
The Reserve Bank has done more to pump up the economy than just lower rates to 0.1%. It's also had its quantitative easing program, or just pushing cash into the economy. It promised $100 billion over 6 months to April this year. And the key question now for investors and markets is, will it go again? It might have to. The Prime Minister hinted today he's unwilling to write any more cheques.
You can't run the Australian economy on taxpayers' money forever.
Well, in the broader economy, we are seeing a recovery underway, but it is very much a patchwork economic recovery story, including in the jobs market. Now, the end of JobKeeper at the end of March may cause some disruption to the job market, but we still anticipate, broadly speaking, that the unemployment rate will head towards 6% by the end of this year.
Another year, another cluster for energy policy, with still no commitment from the government to move to net zero by 2050 and a long-running stoush in the Labor Party forcing a reshuffle. Business is left wanting again. In communities that rely on fossil fuels, people are grappling with the issue of how to reinvent their economies. In Australia's major thermal coal region, about 14,000 people work in mines and more than 600 in power stations. This week on The Business, we investigate how the area of the Hunter Valley is transforming itself for a future beyond the Black Rock. Stephen Long reports from the New South Wales region.
A ship wends its way into Newcastle Harbour, home to the biggest coal port in the world.
That is about 179 million tonnes of capacity per year.
From the port to the mines and the power stations that burn the Black Rock, coal has been integral to the Hunter Valley. But as Australia's major export markets shift to clean energy, the thermal coal industry is in retreat. Coal-fired power too, with Liddell Power Station in the Upper Hunter Valley due to close in 2023, nearby Bayswater in 2035. Gerard Spinks and Carl Kerwin have spent decades in the power industry.
Thanks, fellas. You heard I was thirsty.
At a pub in the valley, They talk about their fears for a region reliant on coal.
All our other main industries are gone. Our steel, shipbuilding, rail, textiles, that's all gone. So all we've got left is mining and power, and once that goes, we've got no idea what the future holds.
So I guess for workers your age, retirement is the option, but what about your kids?
Yeah, what about our kids, exactly?
I've been a State Secretary, I think.
Union official Steve Murphy has the difficult task of telling workers their jobs won't last. His union has formed an alliance with green groups pushing for new jobs.
Well, I grew up in the Hunter, and coal's been part of everybody's working life. If you didn't know someone that was working in the coal industry, then you weren't really from the Hunter. Well, the concern is that workers can't actually see and touch a real job right now. So the only defence they've got for their family's financial security is to defend their current job, and they do that by any means necessary.
The reality is, workers paid six-figure incomes for driving trucks in mines will struggle to find that money elsewhere.
The jobs that we've got right now are really well paid. They look after people, they've got good conditions, they've got the best hours of work and really the best long service leave. And if we just leave it up to the market or private capital to create these new jobs, it's not going to be good wages and good conditions and a good quality of life.
At Singleton in the Hunter Valley, Sue Moore is mayor of a district where more than half the jobs flow from coal.
Welcome. Great for you to come to Singleton. Good to see you.
Oh, it's nice to be up here. She's frustrated by big city attitudes towards coal mining people, telling me about a conversation she had with a local politician in Sydney.
His words were, so what do we have to do to convince Singleton people about climate change? And my reply was simple, well, tell them where their jobs are going to be. It's not a conversation about climate change, it's a conversation about jobs, jobs and jobs. And once jobs are solved, then other things will flow.
The National Party is pushing for a new coal-fired power station here in the Hunter, but there's no way the private sector will fund it. It's no longer a question of if the coal economy will dwindle, it's a question of how quickly. No one industry will replace the many thousands of jobs that coal mining creates. But there are positive signs about an economic revival based on manufacturing and clean energy. Back at the pub, that's where these veteran workers think the future lies.
But the reality is renewables is coming. We're not going to be able to stop that train, so we need to get on board.
And it won't be a coal train.
Stephen Long there, and tomorrow night we'll be speaking to businesses transitioning to a greener future. Well, the economy, climate change and financial regulation are going to be three of the major stories of 2021. Diane Smith-Gander finds herself at the centre of all three. She's just been appointed chairman at buy now, pay later firm Zip, and its share price rallied on the news. She's also chair of the Committee for Economic Development, or CEDA, and a director at energy firm AGL. She joined me from her Perth lockdown. Diane Smith-Gander, we'll start with buy now, pay later space. You've just been appointed chair of Zip. Late last year, the Reserve Bank governor said that right now, buy now, pay later isn't big enough in order to see further regulation. When do you think that will happen?
Well, I think when it happens is largely in the hands of the regulator, and Zip, under my chairmanship, will continue to give great respect to the regulator. But I'm very encouraged that there's an open dialogue, that there's a voluntary code of practice, and I'm very encouraged that Zip, since day one, has always completed know your customer checks and credit checks and so forth. So I think we can walk a good pathway towards the right regulatory settings.
And do you think that regulation is a when, not an if?
Now, we do know that regulatory regimes will always evolve. We know that pricing will always evolve. So I think it really is about each company looking very carefully at what their consumers want, what their merchants want, what their suppliers want, and designing those products in a way that's going to give them success in those competitive markets. This is not a winner-takes-all sort of a game. It's a very large addressable market.
I mean, you were on the board of Wesfarmers for over a decade. You worked in a big bank, Westpac, for over a decade as well. What do you think is likely to be the hot button issue that actually brings regulation if it does come? What will buy now, pay later firms have to do in order to get the attention of regulators, and also a government who said they don't really want to introduce any new regulation?
Look, when you're dealing in other people's money, which financial services companies do, you need to be held to a high standard, and the regulators have a role there. So we're always going to see that regulatory role, and I'm not frightened of that at all. But I'm not going to try to predict where I think it's going to go. What I am comfortable about is that there's an open dialogue occurring and very sensible conversations in the Zip boardroom in particular, and we'll see where those regulatory settings go. But trying to predict that, I think, is above my pay grade.
There's been a huge increase in buy now, pay later use in the economy, particularly over the last year when we have seen record amounts of cash just pushed into the economy by governments and also by banks themselves.
Well, it's pretty clear that we're never going back to the world that was pre-COVID. It's too long to be almost 12 months in this new environment to think that norm reversion will occur. So I think anyone that is planning on extrapolating last year as a prior comparable period is a fool. This is going to be a really big conversation as we go through reporting seasons, where we try to give some clarity about how underlying businesses are actually travelling. And then, of course, companies like Zip that are in startup phase and huge accelerated growth phase, we're always facing into that question as well. So that just adds a degree of difficulty, a bit of a twist to it. So that's one of the things that I'll be focusing on, is how can we get a real handle on what are the numbers we should be comparing against and therefore the targets we should be setting for the next period.
I mean, the Prime Minister said today that they will not be extending JobKeeper beyond March, and he also indicated that he's unwilling to give further help to the economy in the form of stimulus, saying that the economy needs to stand on its own 2 feet and not expect any more help from taxpayers. Do you think, what do you think of a statement like that, given we're only just in February? And like you say, there's still a lot of tailwinds coming out of the most extraordinary year that we had in 2020.
The government is in a very difficult position, federal government and state governments, about trying to balance priming the pump in the economy and thinking about what that means for future generations and the resilience of the economy in general. It's all very well to deal in averages, but when you dive under to individual sectors, you of course do come up with issues for things like tourism. But we also see that in some places we have JobKeeper that may be binding employees to enterprises that are not going to be sustainable going forward, and they're not providing their labour to sectors of the economy that actually need it. So when you hear that some domestic tourism operators are not able to open all of their facility because they don't have enough staff, because those staff are bound to another entity through JobKeeper, you know that some examination and adjustment needs to occur. I think that's what's going on, and I think the Prime Minister is challenging all of us in business to think about the pivot, think about the flexibility. What does this pathway to growth in the future look like?
We're just on the cusp of reporting season. We're going to see some really, really good numbers for a lot of companies who did receive JobKeeper. Do you think that corporate Australia should give some of that JobKeeper money back if they can?
That's a question for each individual company to determine how they think they should best manage their social licence.
Diane Smith-Gander, thank you very much for your time today.
Very much my pleasure.
To the markets, which recovered from a big fall at the open, the All Ords and ASX 200 adding nearly 1% by the close, and the Aussie dollar is sitting around 76.5 US. And that's all from The Business. For more on our stories, head to our website, click on the business page. You can always catch the program anytime on iView. I'm Elise Morgan. Good night.